The rain was coming down in heavy sheets as Sarah pulled into the Redwood Motel. She had been driving along Highway 101 for hours, trying to make it up the coast from San Francisco to Portland. Exhaustion had set in, and she decided to stop for the night in Crescent City, a quiet coastal town surrounded by towering redwoods. The motel was small, dimly lit, and seemed mostly deserted. But Sarah didn't care. She just needed a few hours of sleep before continuing her journey. The receptionist, an older woman with tired eyes, handed Sarah the key to room 9 without much conversation. Sarah parked her car right outside the room and hurried inside, glad to be out of the rain. The room was basic, a little rundown, but serviceable. Exactly what you'd expect from a roadside motel. After a quick shower, Sarah settled onto the bed and scrolled through her phone, feeling the tension of the drive start to fade. But as the rain beat down on the windows, a sense of unease crept in. There was something about the isolation of the place that didn't sit right with her. Still, she brushed it off, reasoning that she was just tired. Around midnight, she heard a faint noise outside her door. It sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate. She froze, her heart racing, and strained to listen. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a light tapping on her window. Sarah's stomach twisted in fear. The curtains were drawn, but whoever was outside was close, too close. She stood up, moving silently toward the window. Just as she reached the curtains, the tapping stopped. She pulled them back a fraction, peeking out into the rain. Nothing. The parking lot was empty, except for her car. "Get a grip, Sarah," she whispered to herself, pulling the curtains shut and locking the door. She tried to calm down, but the unease lingered. Checking her phone, she saw there was no cell signal. Another unsettling detail. She climbed back into bed, but the tension wouldn't let her relax. She kept hearing faint noises, a creak outside, the wind howling through the trees, and every so often what sounded like shuffling footsteps. Then, at around 1 a.m., her phone vibrated. She picked it up, thinking it was a notification, but the screen displayed one message from an unknown number. "I'm watching you." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The message felt like ice in her veins. She tried to call for help, but the phone couldn't connect. Panicking now, she checked the door and windows again, making sure everything was locked. Moments later, there was a loud knock on the door. "Room service," a voice called, but it was off, too mechanical, like someone was forcing the words. "I didn't order anything," Sarah said, her voice shaking. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. "Room service." Sarah grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, backing away as the knocking became frantic, violent. Whoever was outside was pounding on the door now, trying to force their way in. She needed to escape. She ran to the bathroom and opened the small window, but the rain and the narrow alley behind the motel offered no easy way out. Just as she was about to climb out, the sound of splintering wood filled the room. Sarah froze. He had broken the door. Footsteps thudded against the floor, heavy and deliberate, growing closer. She had no time. Heart racing, she dove under the bed, praying that the intruder wouldn't find her. She watched as boots appeared in the doorway, muddy, soaked from the rain. Whoever it was, they moved slowly, scanning the room. The boots stepped further inside, circling the bed. Sarah could barely breathe, her heart hammering so loud she was sure he could hear it. The figure crouched, and for a horrifying moment, she saw his face. A man, his features partially obscured by a hood, but his eyes were dark and full of malice. He leaned closer, scanning the room as if he could sense her presence. Suddenly, he stood up and left the room without a word. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stayed frozen under the bed for what felt like hours, her body trembling with fear. She could hear nothing but the rain outside, but she knew she wasn't safe. Crawling out slowly, she moved to the window and peered into the parking lot. The man was standing by her car, staring up at her room. He had a knife in his hand, glinting in the rain. Sarah's mind raced. She had to act fast. She grabbed her keys, heart pounding, and quietly unlocked the door. If she could make it to her car before he noticed, she might have a chance to escape. She slipped out, rain soaking her instantly. The man's back was turned, giving her the split second she needed. She ran to her car, flung open the door, and started the engine. The noise startled the stalker, and he sprinted toward her, but she hit the gas, tires screeching as she sped out of the parking lot. Her hands trembled as she drove through the pouring rain, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds. He hadn't followed her, but the terror of the encounter clung to her. She didn't stop driving until she reached the next town, pulling into a well-lit gas station. She sat in the car, drenched, her mind reeling. As she calmed down, she realized something terrifying. She had seen that man before. Earlier at the gas station, where she had stopped for snacks hours before reaching the motel, he had been watching her. He must have followed her from there, waiting for the right moment. Shaking, she called the police and reported everything. They promised to send someone to check the motel, but Sarah knew they wouldn't find him. The stalker was too careful, too calculating. From that day on, Sarah never stayed in a motel again, always wary of who might be watching her from the shadows. The memory of that night, of the stalker's face, would haunt her forever. It was a blistering hot day in Barstow, California, and Mark had been driving for hours. The stretch of desert highway between Los Angeles and Las Vegas seemed endless, and the scorching sun only made things worse. When he spotted the neon sign for the Sierra View Motel, it was a welcome sight. The motel was small, with a faded exterior, but Mark didn't care. All he needed was a place to crash for the night before continuing his trip. The clerk at the front desk was a middle-aged woman with a cold, indifferent expression. She handed Mark the key to room 17, barely acknowledging his presence. There was something unsettling about the place, but Mark ignored it, chalking it up to the exhaustion of the long drive. He parked his car outside room 17, a room on the far end of the motel, isolated from the others. As soon as he stepped inside, he noticed the musty smell of stale air, and the decor was outdated, straight out of the 70s. He threw his bags onto the bed and tried to relax, but the atmosphere felt heavy, oppressive. As he unpacked his things, he noticed an odd stain on the carpet near the bed. It was dark, almost rust-colored, and seemed like it had been there for a while. Mark tried not to think too much about it, but a creeping sense of unease began to settle in. Something about the room just didn't feel right. After grabbing a quick bite at a diner down the road, Mark returned to the motel just as the sun was setting. As he approached room 17, he noticed something strange. A man standing in front of the room 2 doors down. The man was tall, with a scruffy beard and a worn-out jacket, staring directly at Mark's room. His gaze was intense, unblinking. Mark's stomach churned. He nodded politely, but the man didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked off into the desert night, disappearing into the shadows. Mark shrugged it off, trying to shake the eerie feeling the encounter had left him with. Back in the room, Mark locked the door, double-checked the windows, and turned on the TV to drown out his nerves. But no matter how hard he tried to relax, he couldn't shake the sense of being watched. It felt like there were eyes on him, from somewhere just out of sight. Then, around 11 p.m., there was a knock at the door. Mark's heart jumped. It was a soft knock, almost hesitant. He approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" he called out, but no one answered. He checked the peephole. Nothing. The hallway outside was empty. His pulse quickened. He opened the door a crack and peered out. Still nothing. Just as he was about to close the door, he noticed a note taped to it. "Room 17 isn't safe." His heart raced. What kind of sick joke was this? He ripped the note down and stepped outside, looking around the empty lot, but there was no sign of anyone. The desert winds howled, and a sense of dread settled over him. Back in the room, Mark felt even more uneasy. He tried to call the front desk, but there was no answer. Something was very wrong. He paced the room, debating whether he should just leave, but then there was another knock. This time, it was louder, insistent. Mark froze. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he slowly approached the door again. "Who is it?" he demanded, his voice shaking. No response. He checked the peephole again, but this time there was something there, a figure, standing just outside the door, their face obscured by shadows. Mark backed away from the door, his pulse racing. He knew he couldn't stay in the room any longer. Without thinking, he grabbed his keys and bag, ready to make a run for it. Just as he was about to open the door, he heard the sound of footsteps running down the hall, toward his room. He froze. Whoever it was, they were coming for him. Mark swung the door open and bolted down the hallway toward his car. As he reached the parking lot, he glanced back and saw the man with the scruffy beard. He was chasing after him, a knife glinting in his hand. Panic surged through Mark as he fumbled with his keys, finally unlocking the car door and throwing himself inside. The man reached the car just as Mark slammed the door shut, his face twisted in rage. He banged on the window, slashing at the glass with the knife, but Mark hit the gas, tires screeching as he sped out of the parking lot. Breathing heavily, Mark raced down the highway, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The man's crazed face was burned into his memory. But as he drove, he realized something even more terrifying. The note. How did they know his room number? And why had they targeted him specifically? When Mark reached the safety of a larger town, he went straight to the police. He told them everything. The note, the man with the knife, the chase. But what the officers told him next made his blood run cold. Room 17 had a dark history. A series of mysterious disappearances had occurred at the Sierra View Motel over the last 2 decades, all involving guests who had stayed in that exact room. The most recent incident involved a woman who had been found murdered, her body discovered months later in the desert near the motel. The police searched the motel that night, but found no trace of the man who had chased Mark. The note was the only clue they had, but it wasn't enough. The case remained unsolved, and the Sierra View Motel kept operating, its grim past buried beneath the desert sands. Mark never stayed in a motel again, and every time he passed through Barstow, a shiver ran down his spine. He knew he had narrowly escaped becoming another victim of Room 17, but the stalker who haunted that room was still out there, waiting for his next target. It was supposed to be a quiet night when Rachel checked into the Saguaro Desert Inn on the outskirts of Tucson, Arizona. She had been driving for hours, making her way from New Mexico to visit a friend in Phoenix. The motel, nestled on the edge of the desert, was the only place for miles, surrounded by endless stretches of sand and cacti. The sun had just set, casting long shadows over the parking lot as she pulled in. Rachel was relieved to finally have a place to rest. The drive had been grueling, and the dusty roads of the desert were beginning to wear on her. The Saguaro Desert Inn looked a bit run down, with peeling paint and flickering neon lights, but it had a certain charm that made her think it would be fine for one night. The man at the front desk, an older gentleman with thick glasses, handed her the key to room 12. "Quiet night tonight," he said with a crooked smile. "Not many guests this time of year." Rachel thanked him, grabbed her key, and headed toward her room, glad to finally relax. The motel was mostly empty. Only 2 or 3 other cars were parked in the lot. Room 12 was at the far end of the row, and as she unlocked the door, she noticed something odd. A lone motorcycle parked a few spaces down, its chrome reflecting the fading light. There was no sign of the rider. The room was small but clean, with beige walls and a desert-themed painting above the bed. Rachel threw her bag on the chair and sank into the mattress, grateful to be off her feet. She flipped through channels on the small TV, eventually settling on the local news. The desert wind howled outside, making the windows rattle slightly. But otherwise, the motel was quiet, too quiet. As she was getting ready for bed, her phone buzzed with a message from her friend in Phoenix. "Drive safe. See you tomorrow. Text me when you leave." Rachel smiled and texted back before putting her phone on the nightstand. She was just about to drift off to sleep when she heard a faint sound outside, a scraping noise like something metal dragging across the pavement. She sat up, listening intently. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but the sound continued, slow and deliberate. Curious, Rachel got out of bed and peeked through the curtains. The motorcycle was still there, but now, standing next to it, was a man. He was tall and thin, wearing a black leather jacket, his face obscured by a helmet. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring in her direction. Her heart quickened. She quickly let the curtain fall back and locked the door. Maybe he was just a guest checking on his bike, she thought, but the unease wouldn't leave her. Trying to shake off the feeling, Rachel lay back down and closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. The wind outside seemed to howl louder, and then she heard the sound again, the scraping, like metal on concrete. This time it was closer. Her pulse quickened as she realized the noise was coming from right outside her door. She held her breath, listening. It was the sound of something sharp being dragged along the ground, slow and menacing. She grabbed her phone and crept toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. With shaking hands, she pressed her ear to the door. A metallic clang reverberated through the night, followed by a soft thud. Someone was out there, doing something to the door handle. She quickly dialed the front desk, but the phone just rang and rang. No answer. Her heart raced. She was on her own. The scraping sound stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then a voice, muffled but clear, came through the door. "I know you're in there." Rachel's blood ran cold. The voice was low, almost a whisper, but it was enough to send terror coursing through her veins. She backed away from the door, trying to stay quiet, but her mind was racing. What did he want? Why her? Suddenly there was a loud bang as the man began pounding on the door. "Let me in!" he shouted, his voice now filled with rage. He slammed against the door, harder and harder, the thin wood rattling with each hit. Rachel grabbed her phone and dialed 911, whispering frantically to the dispatcher as she backed away from the door. "Someone's trying to break in," she whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm at the Saguaro Desert Inn, room 12. Please hurry." The pounding continued, and Rachel's heart felt like it was going to burst out of her chest. The man outside was relentless, kicking and banging on the door as if trying to force his way in. "We have a unit on the way," the dispatcher said, but Rachel wasn't sure how much longer the door would hold. She grabbed her car keys, planning her escape. The windows were small, but if she could get out without him seeing, she might have a chance to make it to her car. Just as she was about to move, the banging stopped. Silence. She held her breath, listening. The tension in the air was unbearable. Then, she heard footsteps walking away from the door, followed by the sound of the motorcycle engine roaring to life. Rachel peered through the curtains again and saw the man speeding off into the desert, his taillights disappearing into the distance. Relief washed over her, but she knew she wasn't safe yet. Minutes later, a police car pulled into the lot, and 2 officers knocked on her door. Rachel quickly explained what had happened, her voice trembling as she recounted the man's terrifying behavior. The officers searched the area but found no sign of the man. They told Rachel to stay put and that they would keep a patrol car nearby for the night, but the fear still gnawed at her. Who was he, and why had he targeted her? The next morning, Rachel left the motel as soon as the sun rose. As she pulled onto the highway, she glanced in her rearview mirror one last time. The Saguaro Desert Inn faded into the distance, but the memory of that night stayed with her. No matter how far she drove, she couldn't shake the feeling that the man on the motorcycle was still out there, watching, waiting for his next victim. From then on, she vowed never to stay at another isolated motel again, especially not in the heart of the desert, where help is always miles away.